Welcome back to another video, friends, and thanks for watching. Today we will present to you life in Colonial Africa. Colonial Africa refers to the period of time when European powers, including Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, and Italy, colonized and controlled various regions of the African continent from the late 19th century until the mid-20th century. The colonization of Africa began in the late 19th century with the Scramble for Africa, a period of intense competition between European powers for control over African territories. By the turn of the 20th century, almost the entire African continent had been divided among European colonial powers, with the exception of Ethiopia and Liberia. Without further ado, let's dive into the events that characterized Colonial Africa. 1. Late 15th century. Early European explorers arrived on the coast of West Africa. In the late 15th century, European explorers began arriving on the coast of West Africa. The primary motivations for these expeditions were to establish trade relationships and expand their empires. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to explore the West African coast, with expeditions led by explorers such as Diogo Cao and Bartolomeu Dias. One of the significant factors driving European exploration of West Africa was the desire to find a sea route to the east, as the overland trade routes to Asia were controlled by the Ottomans and other powerful empires. The Portuguese were particularly interested in finding a route to India, which was a significant source of spices and other luxury goods. 2. Mid-16th century, the Portuguese established trading posts and fought along the West African coast. In the mid-16th century, the Portuguese had already established trading posts and fought along the West African coast. This was a part of their efforts to control the trade of valuable resources such as gold, ivory, and slaves. In addition to establishing trade relationships, the Portuguese also built forts and trading posts along the coast to protect their interests and exert their influence. These forts served as bases for Portuguese merchants, soldiers, and missionaries, and were strategically located at key points along the coast. The Portuguese presence in West Africa had a significant impact on the region, as they introduced new technologies and ideas and helped to shape the economy and political landscape of the area. However, their involvement in the slave trade also had a devastating impact on the lives of millions of Africans who were captured and forcibly transported to the Americas. 3. Late 19th century, the scramble for Africa begins, with European powers competing for colonies in Africa. The late 19th century was a time of intense competition among European powers for colonies and territories in Africa, known as the Scramble for Africa. This period was fueled by a number of factors, including the desire for raw materials, new markets, and strategic military positions. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 marked the beginning of the formal colonization of Africa. At this conference, European powers agreed to partition Africa among themselves and establish rules for future colonization. The conference was organized by the German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, and was attended by representatives of 14 European countries and the United States. The partition of Africa was largely driven by economic interests, with European powers seeking to gain control of valuable resources such as rubber, oil, diamonds, and gold. The colonization of Africa also provided new markets for European goods and helped to alleviate overpopulation in European countries. The scramble for Africa had a profound impact on the continent and its people. European powers imposed their political and economic systems on African societies, often leading to the displacement of local populations and the exploitation of their resources. African societies were forced to adapt to European culture and traditions, leading to significant cultural changes and the loss of traditional ways of life. The scramble for Africa also led to increased tensions and conflicts among European powers, which eventually contributed to the outbreak of World War I. However, it also played a role in the rise of nationalism and the struggle for independence in many African countries in the 20th century. From 1914 to 1918, World War I breaks out, and African colonies are used to support the war effort. World War I, also known as the Great War, began in 1914 and lasted until 1918. The war was fought between the Allied powers, including Great Britain, France, and Russia, and the Central Powers, including Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Many African colonies were used to support the war effort, European powers had established colonies in Africa in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and these colonies were seen as valuable resources during the war. African soldiers were recruited to fight for European armies, and African resources such as rubber, timber, and minerals were used to supply the war effort. African colonies were also used as bases for military operations. For example, the British used their colonies in East Africa as a base for their campaign against German East Africa. The German colonies in Africa were also targeted by Allied forces, with the British and French launching campaigns to seize these colonies. The war had a profound impact on Africa, with many Africans losing their lives as soldiers or laborers. The war also contributed to the growth of nationalist movements in Africa, as many Africans became disillusioned with European powers and their colonial policies. 5. 1920s to 1930s, African nationalism and anti-colonialism movements began to emerge. The 1920s and 1930s were a period of significant social and political change in Africa, marked by the emergence of African nationalism and anti-colonialism movements. These movements were largely driven by a desire to end colonial rule and achieve independence, as well as to promote African cultural and political identity. One of the key factors contributing to the emergence of African nationalism was the experience of Africans who had traveled to Europe or America during World War I and returned home with a greater sense of awareness and self-confidence. This was combined with growing dissatisfaction with colonial rule, which was often characterized by economic exploitation, political oppression, and social discrimination. Some of the key leaders of the African nationalism and anti-colonialism movements during this period included Nkrumah of Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya. These leaders, and others like them, worked tirelessly to organize resistance to colonial rule, mobilize support among the African population, and develop new political institutions and strategies for achieving independence, despite facing significant challenges and obstacles, including violent repression by colonial authorities. These movements gradually gained momentum and ultimately proved successful in many parts of Africa. By the end of the 1960s, most African countries had achieved independence and were able to take control of their own political, economic, and cultural destinies. 6. 1939 to 1945 World War II breaks out, and African colonies are again used to support the war effort. During World War II, African colonies played a significant role in supporting the war efforts of the European colonial powers. Many African soldiers were recruited to fight in the European theaters of war, including North Africa, Italy, and the Middle East. African colonies also provided essential resources, such as food, minerals, and oil to support the war effort. The colonial powers exploited African resources and labor during the war, often forcing Africans to work in dangerous conditions and paying them low wages. The war also brought about significant changes in African societies, as African men were drafted into the army and women were forced to take on new roles in agriculture and industry. Despite their contributions to the war effort, African soldiers and civilians were often subject to discrimination and racism by the colonial powers. After the war, African countries began to demand independence and self-determination, as they had sacrificed so much to support the war effort and felt that they deserved greater political autonomy. The end of World War II marked the beginning of a new era in African history, as many countries began to fight for independence and decolonization. 7. 1950s to 1960s, African colonies began to gain independence from European powers. The period from the 1950s to the 1960s saw a wave of decolonization in Africa, with many African colonies gaining independence from European powers. This process was driven by various factors, including the rise of nationalist movements, the weakening of European powers after World War II, and pressure from the international community to grant independence to colonized nations. Some of the key events and movements during this period include: A. The Pan-African Congress. Founded in 1900, this movement aimed to unite African peoples and promote their political and economic interests. In 1945, the 5th Pan-African Congress was held in Manchester, England, where leaders called for the end of colonialism and the establishment of independent African states. D. Ghana's independence. Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence from a European colonial power in 1957. The movement for independence was led by Nkrumah, who became the country's first prime minister and president. C. Algeria's independence. Algeria, a French colony, fought a long and bloody war of independence from 1954 to 1962. The conflict was marked by guerrilla warfare and atrocities committed by both sides. In 1962, Algeria gained independence after a referendum was held, in which the vast majority of Algerians voted for independence. D. The Organization of African Unity. Founded in 1963, the OAU was a continental organization that aimed to promote cooperation among African states and support their struggles for independence and unity. The organization was dissolved in 2002 and replaced by the African Union. A. The Congo Crisis. In 1960, the Congo gained independence from Belgium, but the country quickly descended into chaos due to political instability and conflict between different factions. The crisis was exacerbated by foreign intervention, with Belgium and the United States supporting different sides in the conflict. Overall, the decolonization of Africa was a complex and often violent process that had profound consequences for the continent and the world. While independence brought new opportunities and challenges for African nations, it also left many struggling with poverty, political instability, and the legacy of colonialism. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next video on African events. You can also add other events of Colonial Africa in the comments section.